The Princess of Spadina, A Tale of Toronto by Ramabi Espinet, illustrated by Veronica Sullivan. It was once upon a time, but not too long ago, at the very end of summer, that three little girls, riding the streetcar, saw the marvelous Princess of Spadina. The girls were all 5 years old. They went to the same school and were best friends. And they were all named Claudia. Their teachers called them Claudia A, Claudia C, and Claudia S. Claudia A's real name was Claudia Anatello. Her people had come from Italy a long time ago. Claudia C's real name was Claudia Chow. Her people had come from Hong Kong a long time ago. And Claudia S's real name was Claudia Singh. Her people had come here from Trinidad a long time ago. And before that, her people had come from Africa and from India. The three Claudias were riding the streetcar downtown with Claudia S's mother. It was the day before Claudia S's birthday party, and they were going to do some shopping. Are we going to buy balloons or whistles? What about party hats? This was Claudia C, who always talked a lot. But all Claudia S could think about was the big green ice cream cone full of nuts that her mother would buy her at the Eaton Center. The streetcar slowed down near Spadina Avenue, and they waited for the lights to change to green. Suddenly, Claudia A held on to Mrs. S's arm tightly. "Look, a princess!" "Where?" "There!" Then they all looked and recognized her at once. She was a real princess, and as soon as you looked at her, you could see that. She was very, very tall and very, very thin, so tall and thin that she looked taller than all the buildings. And her hair, it was bright red and fell about her shoulders in long dreadlocks. There was so much hair that she was almost wrapped in it, except that she was wrapped in a long scarf. The scarf was a mixture of red and green and yellow with a long black stripe in the middle. It was so long that you could hardly see her dress. But the best thing about the princess was her feet. Those feet were the most beautiful running shoes with every imaginable color in them, even bright fuchsia and sea green, and her feet were so big they looked as if they could cover a whole block and come back in no time at all. With feet like those, Mrs. S thought, I could move so fast I could finish all my errands in no time at all. All of this happened so fast that nobody had time to think. They all stared at the princess, who smiled back at them. Suddenly, Claudia A, more excited than anyone else, made for the door. Mrs. S couldn't let her go alone, and soon they were all outside the streetcar on the pavement with the princess. "Are you a real princess?" asked Claudia S. "What's your real name?" asked Claudia C. The princess threw back her head and laughed. She had the most musical laugh, as if all the little rivers and brooks of the world were tumbling over tiny stones on their way to the sea. "Of course I'm a real princess. My name is the Princess of Spadina. Spadina is my home. It is the most wonderful, magical street in the whole world. If you walk down this street, you can buy anything at all." The princess gave another of her extravagant laughs. "Tell you what," she whispered loudly, while she wrapped her scarf around her and shook out her bright red dreadlocks. "Why don't I show you a thing or two? Let's go to the market." So off they went together. The princess stretched her wonderful big feet and moved so quickly it was as if she flew. But the strange thing was that walking with her, they all moved as quickly, as if their tiny feet had suddenly grown big, multicolored running shoes too. Even Mrs. S had to check her own feet now and then. She couldn't believe she was moving so fast. They knew they were near the market before they saw the stores because of the smell. It was the smell of newness and good things like Christmas and balloons and cake and patties, mixed up with the smell of oldness and good things like cloves and cinnamon and peppers and cheeses and dried fish and bunches of onions and garlic hanging down in doorways. A smell of coffee and fresh bread and cookies and huge shrimp, fresh fish and fried meat, and every kind of fruit and vegetable in the world. They walked past the patty shop and the meat shop and the cheese shop and the shop with every fruit and vegetable in the world piled high outside on the sidewalk. They peeped into the fish shop, at the barrels of crabs waving their claws in the air, at redfish and blue-green parrotfish, at clams and mussels and cockles and oysters. Claudia C. wrinkled her nose and refused to go in, so they continued walking down the street. Then they saw the most wonderful, exciting shop anyone had ever seen. The princess's eyes twinkled and she threw her locks behind her as she exclaimed, "This one, my dears, is simply irresistible." They all walked in together and stood in the middle of the shop, looking at the beautiful things around them. The three Claudias felt that they had walked into a magical cave where on every side treasures lined the walls. There were cheeses and spices, dried fruits, chocolates of every description, ruby red jars of cherries, almonds, Brazil nuts, emerald green preserves, golden crystallized fruit. Every kind of present from all over the world was packed into this tiny shop. And what do you think happened next? Just as they were wondering what to buy, the front door of the shop banged hard and a robber walked in. They knew he was a robber right away because he wore a navy blue hat pulled low over his face, and he barked and swore. He wasn't very big, but he made up for that in meanness. "Freeze," he barked at no one in particular. Then to the trembling shopkeeper he said, "Hand over the cash, Granddad, and make it snappy now." Mrs. S. gave a loud shriek of alarm and reached out for the three Claudias. It was then that she saw they had all moved away from her and they looked very strange. Suddenly they filled the entire shop. It was as if no one else was present. Claudia A. stood in the doorway, tall and broad. Her dress was hard and shiny and covered with millions of tiny scales, multicolored, exactly like the princess's running shoes. She growled at the robber, "No passing through this door." Claudia C. looked like a combination of a jack-in-a-box and a giraffe. Her long, thin neck was covered with a multicolored scarf, exactly like the princess's shoes. "And what," she hissed fiercely, "do you think you're doing?" Claudia S. wore the tallest socks anyone had ever seen on her long, strong legs. She looked like a funny kind of ostrich. Her hands had also grown huge and powerful and were encased in multicolored boxing gloves, exactly like the princess's shoes. The robber fell to the floor in a dead faint. His hat had changed from navy blue to multicolored, exactly like the princess's shoes. Mrs. S. sprang into action. "Call the police," she snapped excitedly at the shopkeeper. "Can't you see we've disarmed a robber?" And then she got some smelling salts out of her bag and began to hold it to the robber's nose. In no time at all, the police arrived. When they got there, they saw 3 little girls standing around the doorway, a robber crying into his knees, a still staring shopkeeper, and a busy Mrs. S. with smelling salts, tissues for the robber, and the telephone all around her. And the beautiful Princess of Spadina? Where was she in the middle of all this excitement? She was quietly browsing through the cheeses and preserves at the very back of the shop. In all the excitement that followed, no one noticed when she left quietly by the front door, wrapping her long scarf around her, shaking out her long red dreadlocks, and moving quickly down the street with her big feet. The robber, sobbing loudly now and holding on tightly to his multicolored hat, was taken away by the police. The shopkeeper gave lollipops to each Claudia. They got a whole packet each, with every color of the rainbow. It was then that Claudia A. noticed that she was wearing a huge multicolored shirt, and Claudia C. had a very long multicolored scarf around her neck. Claudia S. was wearing very tall socks, all exactly like the Princess of Spadina's marvelous running shoes. Only then they missed her. "Where's the princess?" they all cried together. They were out of the door in a flash, as was Mrs. S. At the far end of the street, they saw the tall figure of the princess, shaking out her locks and striding ever forward in her large shoes.